Okay, so I'm going to talk about behavioral organization, how to organize behaviors in dynamic field theory, and that means organize them in time. So how to activate and deactivate different parts of an architecture or of a robotic platform over time. And this gets more and more important as you scale up the architectures. You think of an architecture that consists of 10, 20 fields is maybe connected to a robot that has, I don't know, a head and 2 arms and 2 legs. You will want to coordinate that different parts of the architecture are active at some point, different parts aren't. You want to control maybe just the arm movement, you want to keep the head still, that kind of thing, right? And you, very importantly, you may want to do sequences of different actions. So usually if you look at robotic architectures, like the classical ones, you will find algorithms in there that do these kinds of things, right? You see codes of lines of code that say, okay, now move the arm, and then after that, move the head. Now, if you look at our architectures, even if you have like 20 fields, they're all interconnected, you can think of this as a single dynamical system. So it keeps running. It maybe gets input from the sensory system, is connected to motors. So it's always active. And to get in there with algorithmic tools, to manipulate these kinds of fields, that is a second system that you would have to connect. What you would rather want to do is express these kinds of sequential things, the organization, in dynamics as well, so that it's just a single language. And this is what I'm going to talk about. This may be obvious for robotics. It's just as obvious if you look at what humans do, because what we do is usually not, we don't do things simultaneously a lot. We actually do a lot of sequential things. So take this example of getting to work in the morning. There are a bunch of things that you do. You get up, you have breakfast, you take a shower, these kinds of things. You don't do all of this at the same time. You do it in a sequence. And there are certain rules and constraints in that. So some things you actually can do at the same time. You can have breakfast and do that while you're on the way if you're running late. You can't get dressed and have a shower at the same time. And more specifically, for these two, you actually have to do them in the right sequence. You can't get dressed first and then take a shower, right? You have to do them the other way around. For other things, it doesn't really matter. You can take a shower first and have breakfast afterwards, or the other way around. So these kinds of constraints you want to express somehow. Now, what I'm going to talk about are 2 things, and I'm going to hint at this at the end. And these relate to 2 different models that we have. And these have to do with sequences. So the first one is called serial order, and there we care about fixed sequences of things, like telephone numbers. And the elements in these sequences are very similar, like telephone digits. They're pretty much interchangeable. And the order can be more or less arbitrary, right? Behavioral organization is a bit more flexible. So there you could actually do sequences of very different things, like moving your arm and moving your head, or putting something into memory. Also, in behavioral organization, we care much more about these constraints that I talked about before, where you say, okay, these things can be at the same, can run simultaneously. The other things have to be in this kind of sequence. Goal-oriented sequences, I'll say a word about later. So let's look at these serial order things first. So fixed sequences. If you look, this is actually quite an old field. There's a lot of research in it. If you look at the models, you'll see these kinds of plots. So these are activation things. This is actually a ray code model. These are activation of different behaviors over time. So this is the time axis here. And what you will notice is that the duration of these behaviors is always very, very pretty much fixed, right? There's not a lot of variation in how long these take. And this is because they usually look at things like typing, where the duration is actually very similar. What you would, if you look at a robot that does something, or at a human doing something, this is not very natural. If I were to fix the clock or repair something, then the actions that I want to put in a sequence, they can take very long, and they can be very short. So you would actually have to do that a little differently. So in this regular timing that is usually modeled, what you have is some sort of timer that says, okay, now do this, very regular. Here, what you would actually want to do is say, okay, I'm now doing this, and let's see how long it takes. And then I get some signal back from the sensory. I see that I'm finished, and that says, okay, now I can move on to the next thing. So this is an idea that we want to put in the model. And this means that we have to represent the action somehow. So we need stability for representation of an action. So let's say I want to do this sequence of colors, maybe with this robot, look for orange, this weird gray, and blue. So I want, for this amount of time, I want to stably represent, okay, I'm now looking for an orange thing. And then I'm driving around. And once I see the orange block, I get a signal, okay, now I'm done. And now I want to move on to the next thing. There is a conflict, though, between the stability that I'm building up for looking at the orange thing, because as soon as I want to go to the next thing, I have to sort of destabilize this behavior. I want to say, okay, now I'm done. Move this out of the way. I'm doing the other thing. And the hypothesis that we have is that there has got to be some structure like this in the neural representation that says these two things: a stable representation of an action and some sort of signal that destabilizes this representation. And this is just a teaser for later. I'm going to explain this later. We have two fields doing this. We call this intention or action field, which is a stable representation of what I want to do. And then there's a second field. Once this builds a peak, it says, okay, now I'm done. I can move on. I'll explain this in detail later. Now, before I move on to an actual architecture, let's look at some of the methods that you can create sequences with. This is actually from a paper by Henson from '98, and he has looked at different models that generate sequences and extracted these three types. And other models are mostly modifications of these three types. So the first one, let's say you have these behaviors A, B, and C, and you want to do them in some sort of sequence. The first thing that you can do is it's called chaining. So you do your action A, and as soon as you're done, there's a connection from A to B, so you move on to the next one. So this is why it's called a chain. If you wanted to do some other sequence, you would have to change these connections up here, right? This chaining. Then there's an ordinal approach where you have these behaviors, and each behavior has a value or a utility function. So this is some sort of scalar value. And then you have some sort of maximum a winner-take-all mechanism that looks at all of these values, takes the one with the maximum, and then executes this action. So if I wanted to do a different sequence here, I would just have to change the values, and you can pretty much do that online. And then this winner-take-all mechanism would choose another one. This is called the ordinal approach. And then there's the positional approach, where you have a bunch of behaviors down here, and you have another structure up here. These are, they call them, let's call them nodes. And these are always connected so that this stands for the first action in a sequence, this for the second, this for the third. So they always run in this sequence. And then you connect these nodes to the behaviors that you want. So if I wanted to do B, C, A, I would connect this to B, this to C, and this to A. If I wanted to do different sequences, I would have to change the connections between these nodes and these behaviors, right? And what we're going to look at now is a model that Julia did, who's in the back. This is a positional model, but that takes into account these two things: the stable representation of an action and this deep stabilization mechanism. It looks like this. It's actually not all that complicated. What you see here, these two fields, these are the things that I talked about before. She called it an action field. So this is a representation of what the robot is supposed to do over some dimension here. So this is a one-dimensional field. This is activation. The dimension in her case was a color. So it was a robot that was driving around in an environment looking for different colored objects in a specific sequence. You could actually learn those. So if I had a peak here, that would represent I'm looking for, I don't know, maybe a yellow object, right? And this is a stable peak. This has influence on the motor system. So the robot drives around looking for a yellow object. And then there's the second field here. It gets some input from this field, but not enough to create a peak. So there would be some subthreshold bump here. And then it also gets input from the environment. In that case, it would be a camera. So if it looks around and it looks at a yellow thing, then it gets also a second bump. If they two overlap here, then it forms a peak. So what it would look like if it was looking for a yellow thing, but looking at a red thing, then you would have two bumps down here that don't overlap. As soon as it moves over, looks at a yellow object, then you would get what we call the condition of satisfaction. So it forms a peak. And this is your signal, okay, if I'm now done with this action, I now want to move on to the next thing. The sequencing mechanism is up here. This corresponds to these nodes up here, right? And the way this works is you have two sets. For every behavior, you have two nodes up here. So this represents the first behavior. This is the second and third and fourth. So when this is active, I'm now looking for a specific color. The connections between here, Julia actually learned those, but you can also hard code them. So this would be a specific color here, and this would be a different color. So let's say this is active at the moment. So it's now looking for this color. Then I'm doing something. I'm getting a signal. I'm now finished. This inhibits, if there's a peak here in this condition of satisfaction field, it inhibits all of these nodes. So they all get deactivated, which means that this peak is going to disappear. So now I'm not looking for anything. And now, as soon as that peak disappears, this one also disappears. So now this signal is gone, which means the inhibition to all of these nodes disappears. So they all go back up. Now what we want next is that not this activates again, this node, but the next node, the one for the next action. And for this to work, we have these other nodes up here. These are memory nodes. So as soon as one of these nodes is active, it activates its memory node as well. And these memory nodes stay active, even if these are called ordinal nodes. As soon as these are deactivated, the memory nodes stay active, and they sort of say, okay, I've done this at some point. And the way these memory nodes work is they get excited by this ordinal node, but they also excite the next one. So as soon as all of these nodes come back up to the resting level, this node is going to win, and then you get this sequence of actions. Okay. So this is the serial order architecture. Julia implemented this on this robot. I think you've seen this this image at least. So what she actually did was show a sequence of colors first. So then the connections here, these connections were learned, and then there was a different phase where the robot actually started driving around and then looking for these different colors, and then doing this in a sequence. I do have a video for this. What happened? Thing is, I can't see. So now it's training, it's red. I think that's blue, green, yellow, red again. And then now she just places them somewhere. Now the robot is actually, it's a bit stupid. It's just going straight. And then there's an obstacle avoidance mechanism that sort of goes around objects. But there it's found the red, now the blue, now the green. And I think it needs to go this way around or something. The thing is, you can't really see this without looking at the architecture, because now it just looks like it's going by random. But there are actually signals going in whenever it gets close to an object that says, okay, now I've found a red one, now I've found a blue one. Okay, now in this approach, you can actually do repetitions of different colors. So there was red at the beginning and also red in the end. You can't really do that in other approaches. Okay, let's get back to this. Okay, so that's the serial order thing. And now we're going to go on to behavioral organization. So we'll make this a bit more flexible. So this is much closer to this getting up in the morning kind of scenario where you want to put in all these constraints. So we'll come back to this diagram. So we've seen these two fields before, right? This is the action field in Julia's architecture. I call it now intention field. This is a stable representation of what I want to do. Doesn't have to be over color. It can be over space if you want to move your arm somewhere, for example. This has an impact on the motor system. And then this condition of satisfaction field works the same way as before. It gets input from here and from the sensory system, and forms a peak once it's done. Now there are two nodes up here that I haven't explained yet. This is just, we call this intention node. This just activates this field so that you can say, okay, this behavior is now active. If I turn this node off, then this peak would go away and the behavior would not be active at all. And this node, we don't really need it all that much. We call this a peak detector. So this is activated whenever there's a peak in here. What it does is deactivate this intention node. So as soon as you're done here, you deactivate your behavior, and then this is deactivated at all. Okay. So we call this an elementary behavior, and what we do is when we have a robotic system, we take the task that we want to do, we subdivide it into all these little behaviors, and then we put in some sort of mechanism that does constraints and does sequences, and I'll talk about this now. So let's say you have two elementary behaviors. I don't know, move your head and move your arm, and you want to do that in a sequence. So there's an elementary behavior here and one here. And now we want to say, okay, this one is executed first, and as soon as that's done, you can start doing the other one, not before. And we call this a precondition constraint. This is a precondition for this. So we have another node, call this a precondition node, and this is active from the start. It inhibits the intention node of the second behavior, so this cannot be activated at the beginning. Okay. So if you activate this little architecture here, this intention node is activated, so this can run, but this is inhibited, so it cannot be active right now. Now, this precondition node is also inhibited at some point, and that's when this condition of satisfaction of the first behavior is activated. So as soon as this is done, you will get a condition of satisfaction signal. This node turns on and inhibits the precondition node, which then releases its inhibition from the second behavior. Right? So you get a sequence. This behavior first, the second one later. This is precondition. And then we also have suppression or competition. This is a bit different. This expresses that when one of these behaviors is active, the other one can't be. So they basically suppress the other one, right? And let's say you only want this behavior to suppress this on the right here. You would only need a single node, this one, suppression node, that is activated as soon as this intention node is active. This suppresses the intention node of this behavior, so this can't be active. If you want to do the other way around, you need this other node. If you want to do competition so that they mutually inhibit each other, you need both nodes. Okay? That's competition. Now, I implemented this on this Now robot. We have this in our lab. I don't know if you've seen it. It's like a humanoid robot. It's about this size. It can move its arms, and it has cameras in its head. They're weirdly positioned here and here. So I put it in front of this table with all these colored objects, and the task was just to grasp this little block, which in itself is kind of hard because the arms of this robot they're very limited, right? You can't really reach all that far, and the hands are a bit weird. But so we did what I said before. We subdivided this into smaller behaviors. So there's a behavior for moving your head to center the object. So it's looking for a red color. It's moving its head until a red object is in the center of the camera. And then there are behaviors for moving the arm toward this block. There are behaviors for opening and closing the hand. Anything else? There's other behaviors for tracking the hand and so on. But to get this to grasp something, you actually need to put this into some sort of meaningful sequence. You can't start with closing your hand and then moving around. So what you end up with is this huge architecture that I'm not going to explain in much detail, because you can also not read this at all. What you can see here, though, is these little structures. These are elementary behaviors, right? There is an intention node here, a condition of satisfaction node. This is the intention field, condition of satisfaction field for example, this is find a specific color. This is move your head, move your arm is here, and then open and close the gripper, these kind of things. Up here, you'll see there's a precondition node here. Or let's take this one. You move your arm, and only after this you can start visual servoing, so that you start moving your arm a bit more exactly. There is a precondition constraint which says that all of these behaviors can only start if you centered your head so that you're actually looking at the object. Right? These kinds of things. Then it gets input from the camera down here. I can talk to you about this if you're interested. Try to keep this shorter. Maybe I can show you the video now. Okay. So I'll let this run for now. So you saw the head movement maybe, then opening the hand, that's part of the sequence. Now it's starting to move its arm. What I'm actually doing now is changing this on the fly. I'll talk about this in a minute. And then it's starting to reorganize the sequence. This is one of the features of this dynamics, that it's continuously linked to the sensors. It can react to changes. And I'll go back to the architecture in a second to explain this. Now it's using the other arm to grasp, and then there's a close hand behavior at some point to grasp this object. The thing is, these constraints here that give you the sequence, they can be deactivated as soon as this move behavior, move your head, is finished. You get a signal. Okay, I've now done this. I can move on to other things. And this condition of satisfaction signal relies on the fact that the red object is in the center of the camera, right? Now, if I move this, as you saw in the video, if I move the block away, then the condition of satisfaction signal decays, because it's no longer satisfied. And what this does is this node is turned back on, and it deactivates all of these behaviors. Now there was some other behaviors which work for the other arm. I'm not really going to go into detail about this, but as soon as it moves the head toward the other side of the of its body, more or less, it's using the other arm. That's due to, because of the robot. The robot actually can't move its arm across its body center line because the arms are too short. So I had to program it so that the other arm had to be used. But what you actually see is a reorganization of the sequence of behaviors. Okay. What you can also do is, so this was grasping, right? If you look at the activation of these different behaviors over time, you will see that you get a sequence of move your head, then open the gripper, move your arm, then close the gripper at the end. Some other behaviors have to be active the whole time. If you now use different constraints up there, just activating different precondition nodes and competition nodes, you can get a different sequence. I call this pointing. It's a bit cheating. The only difference is that you close the gripper first and open it only at the end, right? So this would be a behavior that is like this, and that do this. Could be pointing, could also be pushing. But you get the point, right? You do a different sequence just by activating different constraints. So this is, oh yeah, and then maybe I'll skip this. So that was behavioral organization. Now the thing is, this may look like it's somehow intelligent, it's doing something meaningful, but that's only because I designed it so that the sequence it was doing, looked like it was doing something meaningful. This is just a bunch of behaviors that get activated in a sequence. What you really want for a robotic system, for an intelligent system, would be goal-directedness. So that means you start with a goal. I want to grasp this. And then it should figure out, okay, now my hand is closed. I need to open it at some point, and preferably before I get there. So these kinds of things are not in here, and are not in here. And we're currently working on this sort of, the idea was first to do a backtracking from a goal position to basically your current position. We have a couple other ideas. So this is goal-directedness. This can be seen sort of as a holy grail for robotics, and this is quite complicated. Right, so these are these three things. And I think I can end it here. If you have any questions about that, we could do a couple of questions. Yeah.
Imagine you give the robot two tasks, like go to the kitchen, get me something, and you find a cat, tell me where the cat is. So you can just, yes, to go to the kitchen, but meanwhile, if you find the cat, you tell him if you found the cat or not. Not necessarily he has to change anything in the task for the kitchen to find the cat. How could we combine both tasks to this kind of structure?
Well, you saw that you can do things you can do things simultaneously, right? It's a question whether in these two tasks, looking for the cat would actually inhibit me from doing something, looking for the kitchen. If they don't interfere, you can just have it running at the same time. And you can activate them simultaneously. Your cat detection thing would run simultaneously with your kitchen navigation system. If they do interfere, I'm not sure. You would maybe have to, then you would need some sort of organization in there.
Just describe the sequence, we could as well do some parallel things.
Yeah.
As long as it's not
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So in the short demonstration by India, you show that the instructor showed the sequence of the products.
Mm-hmm.
So did the robot construct the behavioral sequence by itself, or you hardcode?
So it's It's the same system. So it runs through these nodes. It starts with the first node, and then in this learning phase, it's just looking for colored objects. And as soon as the object gets large enough in the camera, it moves on to the next and memorizes this as the first color. So it starts here, and then let's say you show it a red one. It learns the connections between this node and this action field. And as soon as the object is large enough, you get a peak here. It moves on to the next, to the next one.
At the very beginning, that kind of sequence template was constructed initially by the robot, or like after.
What do you mean by template?
That sequence, like the first color and then the second color and the third color.
Oh, this part up here?
Yeah.
That's built in. So this entire structure is built in, but the connections between the nodes and the fields, those are learned over time, right? And it's kind of limited in this way. I mean, if you only put 4 nodes here, it can only learn 4 things. If you put 16, then it can learn 16. There was a question out there.
Going back to the example about like asking about the two tasks, like go to the kitchen and get a glass.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something like sort of a priority for this task? Like, I mean, your main task would be like to get a glass. So if it finds a glass, maybe on the way to the kitchen, would it like take a glass and bring it back to you? Or?
In this system, it wouldn't. So if you no, if you have 2 things active simultaneously, and you get a condition of satisfaction for either of those, it would just say, okay, I'm done with this, and it's probably going to still do the other thing. So there are no priorities in there at the moment. Sorry. Yeah.
How is the movement of the arm time? I mean, how many degree of freedom?
Okay. This arm of the now it only has 5 degrees of freedom.
So it is not redundant.
It's not redundant.
You have one.
Yeah, and it's actually using the inverse kinematics that's in the API of the now robot.
Yeah,
So what we actually do is just, this is a potential field approach. We set the attractor at the goal position, and then just let it relax there.
Okay.
This is really not how we would do it if we were to move an actual arm, in other projects. But this is just the easiest thing that you can do.
Yeah. So the solution is in the job space. Right.
Yeah.
The potential field approach is an end effector space.
Yes, that's an end effector space.
Schematics and okay.
Yeah.
And
So nothing dynamic about it.
nothing.
Yeah.
I asked because I don't know now.
Yeah, it has very high level functions. You can say things like walk there in X, Y, Z coordinates, and you can move the arm the same way.
And by the cameras, you can see if the object is successfully grasped or not.
No, we can't.
Because you have the condition of satisfaction field. I mean,
It's not for grasping per se. It's more for the behavior was close the hand. You can see that the hand is closed, but you would have to put in some magic so that it knows that the object is in the hand. And since it doesn't have any sensors in the hand, so it can't feel that there's something there.
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah.
Now it's very limited that way.
Yeah.
So we have another robot which has.
So
Yeah. You had a question, right?
Excuse me, for all of these tasks, they have the same level of like resting level or different things?
Yeah.
So is it possible to just by altering this boosting level for each task make the priority for doing this task?
If you put in, let's say you had competition between these different behaviors and you only wanted one of them to be active, you could do it that way, yes. Because they are all activated initially at the same time. If you put in different resting levels, then one would be there first and would suppress the other ones. That could work, yeah. There was something there, right?
Yeah, so you have in the video you change the position of the object, then the robots adapt, which is very important. So how far can this adaptability go? So if the robot is in the middle of the task, but already grasped the object, and you take the object out, so will it also resume from the beginning of the task? And can this be not hard-coded, like part of the dynamical system, rather than having this P neuron that you have on top that has reached the goal or not?
So this particular architecture wouldn't start from the beginning. What you actually need is a behavior that, let's say I take this out. You would need some sort of behavior that moves the arm back to the initial position, and that needs to be activated if you don't see an object or something. We've done that in another project. You saw this blue arm maybe in the lab. We've actually put a table tennis racket in its hand, and then we had it sort of play table tennis. You had a table tennis ball running on an inclined plane, so it always comes back down. And the task of the robot was to hit it back up the plane, and then it comes back. So whenever it hit the ball, so the ball is now moving up the plane, then there's a behavior, as long as the ball is moving up, you have to move the arm back to an initial position and sort of track on the x-axis. So this has this kind of feature that you move back in a sequence, and then you do some sort of rhythmic behavior. But it's not right now. It's not in this architecture. But yeah, you could do that.
Would we get to see the goal oriented?
No. So far we don't have any. If they get to see the goal-oriented behavior, we have some very preliminary studies on that.
Well, I have invited Eric Billy, who did that to lecture here, but he moves to the part of the speed, so he declined to come. So I didn't find it have a module on that. But we can show you, stuff about that. Do we have any slides?
I think we have videos at least of this. This was a scenario where you had some sort of maze. Yeah. So there's some videos. We can show you that. It's a maze scenario where you put a goal position in, and then sort of the activation spreads to the beginning, so the current position. So this is backtracking from a goal, and then it starts moving. That's sort of the
our
idea.
Frontier. We're working on that. He has one version that realizes an old idea we had of backtracking from the target, but it's still under development to think more generally about goal orientation. It's a big topic. Important people which have some perspective of that, and we try to put much more structure into that. So there's lots of room for research in that direction.
Theoretically, you can use what has been tried, like to set an order in these of the actions, like heuristics or reinforcement learning, to find a policy of what to do or what to activate, right? I mean, theoretically.
Yeah, I guess so.
So we had a project, I mentioned that in personal discussion, that Mathis was involved in Luna with our colleagues from Lugano, where we studied the link between reinforcement learning and neurodynamics. And what our insight was really that the discrete times that reinforcement learning algorithms will refer to would be best thought of as event times, times when a neurodynamic system makes a decision. So not equidistant sampling time, but when you go from decision to decision, and after each decision, you use this architecture of conditional satisfaction to trigger the reinforcement and updating of values and so on. And so the policy is the neurodynamics, and the value function is essentially an adaptive burning one of these weights, for instance, up there. It was a more complex architecture, but it would be updating through reinforcement these weights that determine what is the most likely action to be next selected. So that's the whole issue of how discrete and continuous time are related. I think that's the first step. Then there are, of course, a lot of ways of how the actual learning will take place.
Yeah.
What was the paper for that one? Did you guys publish that, or?
This is published in, I think, like 2 conference papers.
Yeah.
I was supposed to produce a journal paper this year. It hasn't happened yet.
Was it Kongsai or?
No, do you remember the conference? Yeah.
If you remind any of us, Julia or Mathis,
Yeah.
they can say.
I can show you, give you the
maybe
paper.
they are on some web page as well.
They're on my webpage and on hers as well.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Yes.
So, as we are talking about the task-driven behavior sequence generation, so there are 2 research issues there. First, you have to make the plan. Second, you have to construct kind of nodes to realize that plan. So I'm wondering the second one, like autonomous generation of those nodes, given the plan. This is already done in your routine. Because the first one, plan generation, you need to deal with relational reinforcement for planning. And backtracking doesn't help if the depth and the branching is large. Yeah. And I think you need to deal with planning in relational reinforcement. But the second issue is like autonomous generation of the construction of the nodes to realize the plan should be like achievable. So I'm not sure which focus is.
So in our language, the plan isn't really categorically different from its real-time realization. The plan is always just some activation pattern unfolding, and even this goal-oriented sequences of the same nature. And so we have different kinds of constraints for that. With the behavior organization, essentially restricts the space of possible sequences already. In that sense, it's learning rules. And if you have that, then that simplifies and constrains the other level that maybe we could call more planning. And that other level we have some ideas about. I would say it's all very open. I mean, we have sort of what we have done is bottom up from our neurodynamics to say if we want really full autonomy, we don't want any algorithm to intervene and say now do this, now do that. We want all of that to be of the same nature, linkable to sensory and motor. It's always just in a sense time continuous and the discrete events emerge autonomous and so on. So from that side, we put in place core elements, this satisfaction. We have done a little bit more than sketched here. We have, for instance, a condition of dissatisfaction picking up ours. And, in different cases, it will have to be explored how general that is. Can we do that across the board? We've done some learning of condition of satisfaction, for instance, in limited scenarios. We have hand-designed behavior organization in some cases. We have this first little element of goal-directedness, and I hinted a little bit. We have reinforcement learning, but I think this requires much more work. And it requires really pushing the limits, showing that this can happen in different situations, and identifying the shortcomings, and maybe seeing if there are additional concepts needed. So we do some research. Julia has a main emphasis in that. Our colleagues from Ghana unfortunately have switched fields, so I think they're not going to contribute in the future. This was Lutchif, I always mispronounce his name, and Soho, Kazumian, and they were collaborators. Mathis does that, Eric Billing does that. There's lots of room. If you're interested in doing that, you can talk about that, and I think as far as we can contribute, we can tell you about know-how about things where we know difficulties around estimating, and I think there's lots of room for doing more work in that field. As you will know, reinforcement learning is a big field in the technical side of it. And I would say the robotics variants of it have remained very limited. And I believe part of that is because everyone says, yes, it should occur on pre-structured systems. I mean, this grid world view is clearly not realistic. But how to actually pull that off? You know, you think of elementary behaviors being that pre-structured. That was our thought. And how to pull that off? There is room for discovery there. That's a very general response. I'm not sure I picked up all the subtleties of what you said. Maybe let's perhaps in person.
Okay, maybe it's time for lunch then.
Good. So this was a much more advanced lecture than mine. We pushed it earlier because Mathis has to leave.
People have